British airborne forces have had the most welcome duty of carrying out the official liberation of the oppressed countries of Scandinavia, beginning with Denmark's capital, Copenhagen. As the planes touch down at the Kastrup airport, there's a joyful rush forward by Danish patriots, who ever since the German occupation have been waiting and hoping for this great moment. The triumphal procession makes its way amid the unrestrained joy of a brave little nation which had become a helpless victim of the greed and rapacity of the Third Reich.
In 1945, Denmark is liberated from German occupation. Happy crowds gather in the streets to celebrate the end of some of the darkest years in European history. And over the next few months, as the dust settles, a new age of optimism and prosperity dawns. But even though the war has ended, not everyone gets to quietly live out the rest of their lives in peace. On February 20, 1948, detectives from the Frederiksberg Police Department in Copenhagen respond to a gruesome discovery at an address on a street called Peter Bangs Vej. A housekeeper has arrived for work at 8 in the morning, only to walk in on a horrifying scene, and the authorities likely have little idea that this marks the start of one of the most mysterious murder cases in Denmark. A case which will go on to spark dozens of theories over the next 75 years. And today, I'm going to talk about a story that is known in Denmark as the double murder on Peter Bangs Vej. It involves the brutal murder of Vilhelm Jacobsen and his wife Inger. And spoiler alert, this case has never been solved. But often when no explanations are offered, it leaves room for people to make up their own. When the cops arrive at 8:18 in the morning, they find Vilhelm with his skull caved in. And the crime scene is a terrifying reminder that although the dark times of World War II have ended, there are perhaps some shadows from the past that are impossible to escape. Before I get started, please consider subscribing to our channel. I'm very grateful for the many people who have chosen to do so already over the last couple of months, and I want to say personally thank you for this. I only want to share these stories with you if I know that people are enjoying them. So as you listen to this entry, feel free to tell us your personal opinions on the case beneath in the comments. Also, this will be the first time that I have split one of my episodes into multiple parts, but as you will soon discover, there are so many details to this story that one entry simply wouldn't be able to cover all the theories that I want to explore. That means the second and final part of this will be available on July 17, so make sure to check back in if you want to hear the full story. With that said, let's get on with today's episode. Let's meet our main characters. Vilhelm Jacobsen was a well-to-do 54-year-old executive at a men's clothing store called English House, which was owned by a company called Carl Holten, where his salary today would have been equivalent to multiple six figures adjusted for inflation. He was a bit heavyset, and he used glasses. His colleagues described him as reserved, and Vilhelm usually did a good job staying out of discussions anytime they were about to get too political. Supposedly one of his vices was betting on horses, which means he often went to the track outside Copenhagen, where he would place his bets with illegal bookies. And Vilhelm also enjoyed playing the card game Bridge with his friends and family for money. 52-year-old Inger, his wife, was a homemaker, but it seems she did a lot less around the house than most other homemakers normally did back then. They had a housekeeper who reported for work every day and handled most of the chores. That meant Inger mostly had to think about preparing and cooking their meals. This gave her a lot of time on her hands, and she would often spend this spare time visiting other similarly well-to-do ladies in the area. Generally, she was described as her husband's polar opposite. Inger was a lively and energetic lady who would interject herself in most conversations around her, but Inger's sense of humor could be a bit controversial for the times. She mostly seemed happy in her marriage, and she and Vilhelm expressed a lot of affection for each other. Their home was in Frederiksberg, which is an upscale area with lots of upper-class and upper-middle-class citizens. Vilhelm and Inger had previously lived in a much larger house in the same district, but after their parents had passed, they had downsized and moved to this new home on the third floor of Peter Bangs Vej 74. The apartment has a hallway that runs down the middle, parallel to the street. In one end of this hallway is the entryway that leads to the stairwell outside the front door. In the other end of the hallway is the kitchen, where another set of stairs leads to the courtyard. On one side of the hallway that splits the floor plan in half, there are 3 smaller rooms: the main bedroom, a bathroom, and a guest bedroom. On the other side of the hallway, there are 3 larger rooms: a dining room, a living room, and a den. This is the 1940s, and the men needed a separate room where they could retire to and smoke their imported cigars, drink their after-dinner brandy, and discuss their manly matters, obviously. It's within these 4 walls that our story starts on February 20, 1948, when Wilhelm and Inger's housekeeper, Asta Hansen, arrives for work and finds her employers brutally slain. One reason why this case has remained infamous for more than half a century is the gruesome nature of the crime scene. I'm about to offer you the pictures that were taken the same day as the discovery of the bodies, so if you think they may be too unpleasant for you to see, this may be a good time to skip ahead to the next chapter. Wilhelm Jacobsen is found lying on his back in the den. The front part of his head has been beaten in, and he is barely recognizable. A blanket has been draped over his body. An armchair has also been placed on top of him, and the back and one of the legs of the chair has been broken off. The chair leg is found next to him caked in blood. Underneath his hand, there is a bloody kitchen knife which had belonged to the couple. Wilhelm's wrist has been lacerated all the way to the bone, but this appears to have been done after he died. Some rags have been wrapped around his neck, and a woman's stocking has been shoved in his throat. A blue bedspread also covers part of his body. Wilhelm's head has been placed on a pillow, and beneath it there is a bouquet of tulips. On his left there is a lamp on the floor, and its cord has been cut. Interestingly, a walking cane has been placed across Wilhelm's body. In the entryway, there were a number of canes leaning against the wall near the door, so the killer had likely grabbed it from there. And this particular one was later determined to have belonged to Wilhelm's deceased father-in-law. Next to him are also his glasses, and a large amount of blood has sprayed across the room and furniture. What makes this substantial amount of detail recorded at the crime scene interesting are the signs of almost animalistic savagery in the way Wilhelm has been murdered, contrasted by what appears to be a great deal of composure and consideration. Not only has someone brutally murdered Wilhelm, but evidently they have clearly taken their time after the killing to ritualistically arrange his body. Inger is found in the bedroom on her stomach, and her head points back at the door. A trail of blood seems to suggest that she has been dragged from the living room, across the hallway, and finally left in the bedroom, and her hair is covered in blood. A pillow has also been placed underneath her, as well as a bedspread, and a duvet from the bed is draped across her. A bloody cloth covers her left shoulder and part of her back, and there are also pools of blood next to her head. And finally, a walking cane has also been placed over her body, and this one used to be her mother's. In the living room, the killer has placed a number of items on a shelf above the radiator. Some dentures, an ear cuff, and 2 combs. The items have been lined up minutiously, and they are covered in blood. It's unclear if this was done to clean up the scene or to send the cops on a wild goose chase, or if it was simply a random decision, but all 3 items did belong to Inger. Not surprisingly, there is also yet another pool of blood in this room. The blinds and the curtains have been closed, which they had also been in the bedroom and den as well. Around the home, some of the strings for the curtains have been removed, and in several places, electrical cords have also been severed, even behind some of the heavier furniture. Some of these trimmings have been left behind, but the rest are not there anymore. And then there's a small set of figurines that resemble an orchestra, which has also been rearranged. Other than the brutal scene of murder and mayhem, the rest of the apartment appears remarkably undisturbed. It hasn't been looted. Sure, there are some cupboards that have been searched, but all of Inger's expensive jewelry, as well as their silverware, is still there. Now, this is an important conclusion for the detectives to reach. When items of value have been removed from a crime scene, this often leads the cops to suspect that the perpetrator's goal was enrichment. But if nothing of value has been taken, how could this have been a burglary? Okay, I know this was a lot of detail, and I know that I probably repeated the word blood quite a few times, but I don't expect you to remember all of it. I just needed to explain exactly how the crime scene was found so you understand the basic facts before I move on. Each of those facts that I mentioned have played a part in the dozens of theories that have materialized over the years, and I will do my best to refresh your memory as we talk about these. And with that said, let's start by considering the most simple explanation as to why Wilhelm and Inger had to die. The general perception of what unfolded that day is that the couple is murdered in the late afternoon the day before their bodies are discovered. Inger is most likely killed first in her living room, after which she is dragged into the bedroom. This means that when Wilhelm comes home from work, her body wouldn't immediately have been the first thing he saw. Instead, he would have soon been surprised by the assailant, then seemingly tied up with the curtain strings and electrical cords, after which he had been tortured for hours and eventually beaten across the head with the leg from the broken armchair. And finally, after he had died, the killer had sliced his wrist so he would bleed out, possibly to make sure he would indeed not survive the ordeal and tell the cops who had attacked him. So, when I said earlier that these murders were brutal, I wasn't lying. Much of the information on the case actually remains classified, but a number of authors have gained access to the archives over the years, and one of them even reprinted the pictures from the subsequent autopsy. When you open his book, these photographs are printed on some of the first couple of pages, and the author gives you no heads up. And I will be honest with you, they are possibly some of the most gruesome autopsy pictures I have ever seen. I've already shown you pictures from the crime scene where the bodies are seen mostly covered, but these images from the autopsy are much more graphic, so you will not see them in this episode. First of all, if I showed those pictures, YouTube would likely remove this video within a day. And secondly, I don't think it's necessary to show them in order for you to fathom the brutality of the crimes. But if you are too curious, it's up to yourself to determine if you want to see them. The book they're printed in is called Dobbeltmord og Edderkopper, and it's written by Erik Heest. But don't say I didn't warn you. I mentioned before that it appeared little of value had been removed from the home. Some cash was gone and also half a bottle of brandy, but that seemed to be about it. But when the terrified housekeeper, Asta Hansen, phones for the authorities and the cops descend on the scene, they need to at least consider the idea that Wilhelm and Inger had simply been the victims of a random robbery that had gone horribly wrong. Maybe Inger had been surprised by a burglar, and in the scuffle that ensued, the person had killed her, and then maybe Wilhelm had returned from work before the killer had time to flee the scene. Like I mentioned, Frederiksberg is an upscale area, even today. It's not hard to envision that someone planned to do a quick break-in, steal some valuables, and then sell them for profit. It could be that the killer had gone from door to door with a made-up purpose, eventually reached their home, then decided to make it their target. It would have been obvious that the couple had money. They had several pieces of expensive antique furniture, so it makes sense if someone dropped in and realized the potential to make some quick cash. But again, this theory seems initially unlikely when you consider so little of value had been taken. I want to mention at this point that there were actually a couple of checks missing from Wilhelm's checkbook. This was a brand new checkbook, and these two checks were the only ones that had been taken out. The inscription in the sidebar for the first one read 8,500 kroner, myself. But the second one didn't say anything, and this was odd because Wilhelm would always duly note down why he had taken out a check. But while these checks were never found, they were also never deposited or cashed. And as you start to connect the clues left at the crime scene, the explanation of a burglary gone wrong also becomes increasingly improbable. I mentioned before that the theory is that Wilhelm had been tortured for hours before he had been killed. But why would a random burglar go so far as to do this? It seems like a lot of trouble to take on, and you would imagine the risk of being discovered would have been much higher because someone could have heard Wilhelm's screams. Another fact that stands out is that both of the victims' faces had been covered up. The broken armchair had been placed over Wilhelm's head, and a blanket and bedspread had been draped over him. And Inger had similarly been covered by a duvet. When detectives see this, it often leads them to suspect that the killer had some sort of emotional connection to the victims. Maybe even because he or she knew them personally. Forensic experts later determined that the lamp that was found next to Wilhelm, which was broken, had likely been used to strike Inger across the head, as the glass shards on it matched a deep gash in her skull. They both died from significant cranial bleeding as the result of blunt force trauma, which ruled out the walking canes as potential murder weapons, because they would have been too fragile. So what was the purpose for the manner in which these canes were ritualistically placed across the bodies? Both canes had already been in the home. Like I mentioned, there was a whole bin of them in the entryway. Some people have pointed out that the shapes of the canes and their bodies made up a cross when you put them together. Was the killer really a religious person who wanted to give them some sort of final dignity? Was this his way of easing his guilt before his God? Well, to conclude this, the theory of the murders being the aftermath of a burglary gone wrong definitely needed to be considered, but there were simply too many facts it didn't explain. After the discovery, other people in the building are questioned. The most useful bit of information is provided by the housekeeper in the apartment beneath, Miss Jensen, who had heard several loud thumps from Wilhelm and Inger's living room during the night. Miss Jensen believed them to be the sounds of heavy furniture as it was moved around. Meanwhile, the cops start to map out the couple's personal business, but both Wilhelm and Inger lived relatively quiet lives, had fairly small social circles, and their lives generally followed the same weekly patterns. But as the authorities embark upon one of the most extensive investigations in Danish history, several individuals do emerge as persons of interest. Eventually, the case would result in more than 10,000 interrogations and more than 3,000 reports written. And like I've already mentioned, there are dozens of possible explanations as to what happened that day in February of 1948. So let's explore the main theory that the cops seemed most focused on as time went by. Classic criminology identifies 7 specific reasons why anyone would kill someone else: jealousy, enrichment, revenge, rejection, fanaticism, desire, and power. And the most common of these is jealousy. Most homicides are committed by people that know their victim. We have all heard tragic stories where the husband or wife kills their partner in an emotional fit of jealousy. Or maybe a scorned lover feels betrayed and makes the fateful decision to end their beloved's life. Is this really what happened in this case? Upon the discovery of the bodies, the cops stationed 3 officers outside the home to make sure no one disturbs the scene. But it appears later that several people are able to gain entry. In fact, it's later estimated that as many as 29 people have been inside the crime scene after the discovery of the bodies. And one of these is a friend of the married couple. So let me introduce you to Erik Ramdal. Erik Ramdal arrives at the scene around 9:30 in the morning, so merely an hour and a half after the cops have been alerted. And he tells the authorities that he heard about the murders from his wife, who had been phoned by one of the other people that lived in the building. Erik had immediately left his work nearby to go to the crime scene at Peter Bangs Vej 74. It's this man, Erik Ramdal, who emerges as the first suspect. While the day of the discovery progresses, the officers on scene start to quietly whisper to themselves. Erik Ramdal had arrived surprisingly early on, and he appears overly eager to help out. The idea of a perpetrator who returns to the scene of a crime is not unheard of, so fairly quickly, the detectives ask Erik to join them at the station so they're able to question him. Initially, he's full of explanations. It couldn't have been him because he was at a choir practice. But the cops look into this story, and they soon determined that would have been impossible. His choir practice had been on another day, and it hadn't been around the suspected time of the murders anyway. Of course, Erik apologizes and claims that he misremembered, then quickly comes up with another alibi. But for every new story he gives them, they only offer more confusion. In fact, the detectives are so suspicious of Erik that over the next couple of years, he is summoned to the station more than 20 times for questioning, and each time there seems to be more and more holes in his story. But Erik is never charged. He remains on their radar up until 1955 when the case is eventually suspended, and over the course of those years, Erik becomes a person of interest in the media as well. It sort of seems like he enjoys the attention a bit, and the Danish tabloids print stories about him several times. Decades later, retired detectives would still claim that they believed Erik Ramdal had actually been the killer, and it seems that the person who mostly adhered to this theory was an officer called Paul Dam. Back in 1948, Paul had been one of the youngest detectives assigned to the case. He passed away in 1999, and until his death, he was convinced that Erik Ramdal, who was a really close family friend to Wilhelm and Inger, had been the real murderer, and he had acted alone. But the cops had simply never been able to compile substantial proof to support this theory. Erik Ramdal had been aware of this suspicion, and he would jokingly mention many times to the authorities that if he really was the killer, he would promise to leave a written confession behind the day he eventually died. Over the years, Erik remained very interested in the story, which is understandable given his personal relationship with the victims, and he collected clippings and articles from many different newspapers. This compilation was gathered into a folder, which upon his death was handed over to the cops. And when they opened it and looked inside, they were likely curious whether or not they would really find a letter from the deceased Erik Ramdal in which he admitted to the murders and apologized for his actions. But they didn't. And when Eric passed away, the truth as to whether he was really the killer or not died with him. But there was also another man that remained a person of interest for a while. Apparently, Inger would frequently go to see a fortune teller, and at several of her sessions with the lady, she admitted that she had taken a lover. This was corroborated by a number of other people that knew the couple intimately. So to this day, it's actually considered more or less confirmed that Inger, at least for some time prior to the murders, had been cheating on her husband. When her body was discovered, there had been a scrap of paper in her pocket with a phone number on it, and this number had led the authorities to quickly determine the identity of this man. It actually turned out to be a senior employee at English House, which means that he had been one of Wilhelm's colleagues. This theory is heavily pursued in perhaps the most well-known book written on the case, which is by the author Peter Bangs. Evidently, Koh gained access to the archives kept by the authorities on the matter, and his conclusion is that the person whom he simply identifies as Mr. X had indeed been Inger's lover, and when Inger had threatened to expose their affair, he had felt forced to kill her, which means he had needed to get rid of Wilhelm as well. Mr. X then returned to the apartment later, after the sun had set, to deliberately rearrange the crime scene in a way that would confuse the cops and make it very hard for them to establish a motive. Because he had been one of Wilhelm's colleagues, Koh even claimed he could have been responsible for the death of a former bookkeeper at the company, who had taken her own life back in 1947. Her death had only been briefly explored, but many felt there had been more to it. Is this really the explanation for why Wilhelm and Inger had to die? Was it indeed a scorned lover who acted with an emotional fury and committed some of the most brutal murders Denmark has ever seen? While they started to look closer at Erik and this unnamed employee at English House as potential suspects, the authorities still needed to consider all possible explanations. They questioned hundreds of people who in some way were familiar with the couple, and they soon established a timeline of both Wilhelm and Inger's whereabouts on the day before their murders. And this timeline will be the first chapter of our next episode, because as you will soon learn, some very odd details quickly emerge. It's these observations and testimonies that have later fueled some of the more convoluted theories, which you will learn all about when I return for our next entry on July 17. Were Polish spies behind the crimes? Or was it Nazi holdouts, or former resistance fighters, or henchmen who worked for the notorious spider Sven O. Hasselstrøm? Is it possible that Hasselstrøm had enlisted the help of the cops to either prevent anyone from entering the home around the time of the murders? Or is it possible that these cops were actually the very people that killed Wilhelm and Inger? There were rumors in the criminal scene for years after the murders. Rumblings that everyone knew what Wilhelm Jacobsen had truly been up to and who had been responsible for his demise. But everyone kept quiet. No one ever spilled the beans. Check back in next time. I promise you will not want to miss it. Because trust me, you still haven't heard the theory, which I think is most likely the real explanation behind the murders. If you haven't done so already, make sure to subscribe to our channel. I'm truly grateful for all the support I've received so far, and I hope that you will continue to let me know your opinions on the stories that I cover in the comments beneath. Especially for this case, as it so often divides people's opinions. So don't hold back. I will be back soon with the rest of the story. Thank you for watching.